Good afternoon, everyone. As many may know, my name is Dalee Sambo Dorough, and I'm very, very pleased to moderate this particular panel this afternoon, Indigenizing International Law. Before I call upon our distinguished panel members, I wanted to make a couple of opening remarks. We know that human groups live together and that they have ways to manage themselves and all of their affairs. The same is true for Indigenous peoples. And I say this because many believe that Indigenous peoples do not have legal traditions, and certainly we don't call them legal traditions, but we have legal traditions, meaning that we have been indigenizing law and indigenizing international law for centuries. It was Val Napoleon that brought about this whole field of Indigenous legal traditions. She's a scholar, an Indigenous scholar based at University of Victoria, and has made significant strides documenting Indigenous legal theory, Indigenous legal traditions. So again, Indigenizing international law has been going on for centuries, and we're slowly and incrementally returning to that moment before life-altering human encounter set in motion by colonialism. And these are the words of James Anaya, a legal scholar based at University of Colorado, who was a UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Colonialism and its impact can't be understated, but it also has driven Indigenous peoples to become advocates and diplomats at the international level to continue this enterprise of indigenizing international law. So in the field of law, we've expended a lot of time, energy, and resources on regaining the status that we had before all the trouble started with our encounters with nation states. And we've been focused on trying to alter the behavior of nation states and to move them away from purely having a nation state of mind through the UN and elsewhere. At the Arctic Circle assemblies, we've been messaging this consistently from the outset. Our work has resulted in the emergence of an important trilogy of international human rights instruments that more accurately reflect the cultural context of Arctic Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples around the globe. By this, I mean specifically the International Labor Organization Convention 169, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the OAS's American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So through our advocacy and over time, since first contact, we've been trying to alter state behavior. And in my estimation, we've been fairly successful at altering state behavior. And even through the halls of assemblies like this, we are working to alter state behavior. And the evidence that I want to bring forward at this moment is the fact that opinio juris is changing. And opinio juris, those familiar with the International Court of Justice and its statute, it's one of the four sources of international law. It's an opinion of law or an opinion of necessity. So states have been responsive to Indigenous peoples by altering their particular behavior. And this is really crucial because it's lent itself to the emergence of pertinent norms and rules in the neighborhood of customary international law, which also suggests that states not only alter their behavior, but now also have solemn commitments and obligations in international law. Yesterday, we heard from an Arctic state representative who invoked the need to maintain the international legal order. So I simply want to say that international human rights standards specific to Arctic indigenous peoples is a part of the body of international law invoked by that state representative and invoked at every moment that state representatives, UN member state representatives, call upon the significance and the importance of international law. And we're seeing this opinio juris emerge in stipulated treaties, the most recent of which is the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, which actually explicitly acknowledges the importance of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and, significantly, indigenous knowledge. So these binding instruments exist out there, and they complement the customary international law that is emerging out of the efforts of indigenous peoples. So I think we cannot downgrade in any way, shape, or form the significance of the contributions that Arctic indigenous peoples have made to indigenizing international law. We're very fortunate this morning, or this afternoon, to have Pirita, a Sámi woman, to illustrate some of the ways in which she and her people have work to indigenize international law. So please, Pirita, you have some opening remarks and commentary to share. Rihanna.
Thank you, Dalee, and thank you, Arctic Circle Assembly, for the invitation to come and speak in this wonderful event. I was here last year, and it's nice to return, and I've seen many, many familiar faces already. I'd like to start on a high note. So there are some achievements together with the nation states which have come into our area, Sámi, and I'm speaking of Finland, Norway, Sweden, and to some extent Russia. They have, of course, divided us with their national borders into 4 areas, but we feel, and the way we live our life and the way we consider ourselves, the Sámi are one people. We've been working with Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and we have a good starting point for indigenizing international law, but also kind of the national working environment. The constitutions acknowledge that we have status as an indigenous people in our respective countries in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And we have also the Sámi parliaments, which are the official voice of the Sámi. We've made an agreement with the governments and the parliaments that it is through the Sámi parliaments that the voice of the Sámi people is brought into the discussion, the political decision making. But there are, of course, some challenges as well in implementing some of the obligations and some of the rights that we have, and those are the challenges that we see at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, given the current global environmental and political crisis, if I can call it that, what are some of the central legal challenges that the Sámi in Finland or broadly Sámi across Sámi, your traditional territory, what are some of those challenges?
One common struggle and challenge that we see in all of the countries that we live together with is that although the governments and the officials have an obligation to negotiate with the Sámi as an indigenous people, they are not doing it properly. They are either not doing it at all, or they are only doing part of it. And we see cases in each of our countries where especially the principle of free, prior and informed consent that is part of international law, and that applies to indigenous peoples as well, is not followed and is not fulfilled. And unfortunately, there are cases popping up here and there across the wide Sámi land where we see this happening. On the Swedish side, there are a lot of mining projects, wind power, but especially the mining threats, the huge mining areas and mines that they want to open. They fail to properly negotiate with the Sámi and really listen to what we say. The same happens on the Norwegian side. Now there's a huge boom with wind power, Again, the same happens. The Sámi tell that this is not an area where you can come and put up your huge infrastructure, industrial areas, but they do nevertheless, and there have been then decisions from the, for example, the High Court in Norway saying that these projects and their implementation were against international law and also Norwegian law. And there have been huge demonstrations and processes around some of these issues. On the Finnish side, we see all of this as well. And there's a very recent case I want to tell you about. On the 10th of October, so just a couple of weeks ago, 2 UN treaty bodies published their decisions, which in fact are human rights violations. So what happened, if you know the map of Finland, it's like a maiden with one arm held up. Here in this arm of Finland, there have been cases where the Finnish state and its officials have given mining exploration permits and also reservations to state officials and indirectly to international companies without adequate free, prior and informed consent, without adequate negotiations with us, the Sámi, and also without impact assessment. And all of these constitute a human rights violation according to 2 UN treaty bodies. And these are huge wins for us. Those decisions tell us that the world is watching. You can't do whatever in these countries. Although we are a minority and we are an indigenous people, we are very small in number, only 10,000 on the Finnish side. And I understand politicians may not listen to us because we don't have that many votes. But we are so grateful for the international attention in bringing up that many of these cases constitute a human rights violation, and that really the FPIC is real and it has to be followed. And it's not enough just to, come once to the Sámi and tell what kind of a project you are planning, but you really need to collaborate, work with us, and also listen to us. And one anecdote, this mineral exploration permit that was given in the arm of Finland, it was the first one that was given in the Sámi homeland during the new Mining Act in Finland. And this is a bit of a scandal that this first exploration permit led to a human rights violation. Something needs to be improved.
Absolutely, thank you. I want to come back to the question of sustainable and equitable development, but before we do that, allow me to call upon Kate Mackintosh, who's opening, in my view, an area of significance to the entire world community, if you'd like to make some opening comments.
Thanks, Dalee, and greetings, everybody. It's really an honor to be on the stage with these 2 ladies, and I'm learning a lot already from just having met you and listening to you. So I want to talk about the new and emerging norm around an international crime of ecocide. So an international crime actually follows really well from what you were just explaining. So the idea of an international crime, of course, born after World War II, is the idea that there are certain acts which cannot be left to be regulated by nation states. In fact, the whole of us as a global community have decided that they're beyond the pale. And there'll be international crimes that are of international concern, also because wherever they're committed, they're a crime against all of us. So currently 4 international crimes that can be prosecuted at the International Criminal Court: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression or invading another country. Our proposal, or the proposal I'm here to talk about, is to add to that the most serious environmental destruction. And the idea of including the most serious environmental destruction into this category of international crime has actually been around already for half a century. It was first talked about in the 1970s in the wake of the Vietnam War, in connection with the use of Agent Orange and exfoliants in that conflict. And it's been talked about ever since, has bubbled around. It's been an idea that's been here for half a century, but, as I like to say in the last couple of weeks, perhaps an idea whose time has come. Because just last month, on the 9th of September, 3 largely indigenous nation states, Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa, have made a formal proposal to include ecocide in the statute of the International Criminal Court. So to add that fifth crime. And that comes on the heels of a couple of other developments at regional level. So at EU level, the Environmental Crime Directive came into force in May of this year, meaning that all EU member states now have 2 years to criminalise, among other things, acts comparable to ecocide. And also at national level, that came on the heels of initiatives at national level, including in Belgium, I don't know if there are any Belgians in the audience, but the new Belgian criminal code includes a crime of ecocide. And all of these developments at European level, national level, and the proposal of Vanuatu, Samoa, and Fiji revolve around the same definition of the crime of ecocide, which I can just tell you what that is. It's a lot of words, and I'd be happy to unpack it, and maybe I can pull out some of the more significant elements later. But the proposal for this international crime is that it would be unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So I think I'll leave that there for the overview. That's where we are. Ecocide is moving from an idea into reality. And I think it's, there are many ways in which it's very relevant to the struggles that you're telling us about and to the indigenous structures of international law that you traced for us, Dalee.
Yeah, and given the background and expertise of the two of you, I want to tie that together. So in what sense does a crime of ecocide represent the indigenization of international law?
I think there are a number of ways. It's very significant that those largely indigenous nations have stepped up to propose it. So as I said, Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa are the 3 nations that have made this formal proposal. And I think that's for a number of reasons. And one is, to go back to your introductory remarks, of course, the close connection between ecocide and colonialism, which is felt, very deeply by those indigenous nations as well as indigenous peoples around the world. I also think that ecocide complements the crime of genocide in a sense, in that it represents an understanding that destruction of our natural environment is very much related to destruction of people or perhaps of a people. And that is the very fact of taking environmental harm into international criminal law, which has been so focused on just the human person so far. But to bringing in this ecocentric approach, I think, is both reflective of and helpful to the kind of indigenous perspective that you've both been referring to. And then, quite specifically, in the definition that's been proposed, these terms, the threshold of damage was severe and either widespread or long-term. There's also a proposal for what each of those terms would mean. And in the term severe, there is language which makes clear that severity of harm, in assessing severity of harm, a court can take into account the cultural significance of elements of the natural environment. And that's very much something that's been missing in international criminal law, for sure, the cultural value, the cultural significance of elements of the environment. So the environment per se already is not adequately protected, but certainly the eco-cultural relationship of humans to the environment has not been connected in any way, and that's something which this new crime would bring in.
Okay. And given the challenges that the Sámi in Finland, but across Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia as well, and you've described some of them specifically, would you in any way place them in the neighborhood of ecocide and what Kate has shared? Or what would be the elements of, from an indigenous perspective, of, again, the neighborhood of ecocide?
Well, what I hear from Kate, it sounds like the Western world is waking up to the understanding that we already have as an indigenous people and as indigenous peoples around the world, an understanding that we humans are not above nature, that without nature we are nothing, and it's not actually us who are deciding and controlling things. It is nature and the animals and the fish who decide on our behalf. And therefore, we really need to protect the environment and the nature. And I'm really glad to hear that there are signals like this where perhaps to the broader attention, all of this thinking is brought. Of course, the context and the timing is interesting and really significant because we are in a situation where the Western world has used up much of its nature, logged the wood, for example, around Europe, and there's industry built everywhere. And now the Western world is turning their eyes to our lands, indigenous lands around the world, and thinking, oh, we found an empty spot on the map. Great, let's put up more industry here, more infrastructure, without realizing that these areas are not empty spaces on the map. If, for example, Sámi might look empty on the map, but it's our home. And it's especially home for our reindeer, for our fish, for our elk, for all the plants and all the natural materials that we use for our Sámi handicrafts and so on. And it's also therefore the home for us humans. And we are nothing without the nature and the environment. And that's why we've been protecting and safeguarding our lands and our waters. It's not only for us and our generation, but it's for the generations to come. And I think where this ties really nicely, the thinking of ecocide, that we need to think about the next generations so that they can continue to live on a planet that is clean, livable, there's clean food and good living for everyone, not only for humans, but for the whole ecosystem as a whole, because we are not the ones that control it. It is really the nature that makes the decisions for us, so we need to work together with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that you said early on in your comments, and the challenge of implementation at the micro level where Indigenous peoples are closest to the land. And that has been a challenge across the Indigenous world, is that, yes, we've been able to alter state behavior, gain greater recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples. The UN General Assembly adopts the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but it's implementation. And I suppose in the area of ecocide and the threshold for proving and demonstrating something like the severity of an action or an event, I wonder who would be potentially liable under the crime of ecocide, and how the mechanisms and the various aspects of putting it into play, of implementing such the substance and procedure. And again, because we have such a challenge just with the norms that we've advocated for and succeeded in gaining. Kate, do you have
So, well, first of all, I should say that, of course, the crime of ecocide, the threshold is very high. So there may be things that would be prohibited under international human rights law that would not necessarily reach the level of a crime of ecocide, because it's an international crime. So we're talking about something that is on the same level as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And that is a powerful tool. So we want to restrict that to the most serious, the most egregious violations. So the idea of the crime, if it is, or when it is adopted at the International Criminal Court, because I am entirely confident that that will happen, that will mean that states who are part of that International Criminal Court system and who accept that new crime, essentially, first of all, they're committing to prosecute that themselves. So the International Criminal Court system relies on states agreeing to prosecute those crimes themselves domestically. If a state is unable or unwilling to prosecute the crime, then the court in The Hague can step in and can take the case. But it's very much the idea that it's a complementary relationship and that the primary responsibility remains with the states to prosecute those crimes. You asked about who would be responsible daily. So as I said, it's really the very high threshold. It's only the most egregious harms. So we would be looking at individuals, but the International Criminal Court is only individuals who are held responsible, so not corporations and not states, just individuals with a significant amount of power, because you would have to be, as an individual, in a position that your own decisions, your own acts or failures to act were, caused this substantial risk of that level of harm. So potentially we could be looking at senior government ministers. We could also be looking at people with senior positions in corporations. And I think, if I may just interject there, that is a very powerful aspect to a new crime of ecocide, because I envisage, and our colleague Jojo was talking about this earlier this morning, actually, a related event, but I envisage the deterrent power of an international crime of ecocide on corporate actors being significantly higher than the deterrent power of some of the current crimes being on the political actors who have found themselves in front of the International Criminal Court. Because I think they are, to a certain extent, less rational actors, more ideologically, politically driven, whereas a corporation is almost, almost by definition, a rational actor bound by share price, looking out for reputation. And of course, the power of this crime would be in its deterrent effect. The idea is not to arrest a whole load of people and have them serve a sentence. The idea is for this crime to shift behaviour. And that's actually what we're hoping for, and what we see not only in the crime as a practical deterrent, but also in its narrative power. That to say this is an international crime, this kind of action, the destruction of the environment, the kind of things that we've been hearing about, not just bad, not just undesirable, but actually criminal on an international level, may steer behaviour in ways that, we urgently need to happen.
Okay. I've been thinking about the linkages, because we know that one of the key characteristics of human rights is that they're interconnected, that they're interrelated, indivisible, and interdependent. And if one reads the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there is reference to a safe and healthy environment. There is the right of Indigenous peoples to the productive capacity of their lands and the environment. So I could see the intersection from an Indigenous people's perspective. I'm wondering, Pirita, if you can share with us a bit more about how the Sámi, either those in Finland or across Sámi, have been able to use the various different indigenous-specific mechanisms at the UN. Because along with the altering state behavior, the effort to alter state behavior, we've been able to influence the UN to create very indigenous-specific mandates that are responsive to our cultural context. And how has this been useful to Sámi?
Yeah, our generation is very, very grateful for Indigenous professionals like yourselves who have been working on these mechanisms and mandates for decades and for years and years, and have created forums and mechanisms within the UN that are very Indigenous specific and help us from a professional point of view, but also as meeting places where we Indigenous peoples from around the world, from the 7 socio-cultural regions, can come together and work together with the UN and with the member states to strengthen international law and Indigenous, and to indigenize international law. And also those are tools and meeting places that are really important for the solidarity among Indigenous peoples. And it gives us a lot of strength, for example, to continue our fights when we, for example, annually meet at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues and talk with other Indigenous peoples, hear about their struggles and understand that many of the struggles and what we're facing are very similar. And we learn from each other and what we've been doing, what solutions we have found and so on. And then we can go back and we feel like, okay, we're not alone in this fight. So all the work that you have been doing, we really want to thank you and everyone who's been involved. Another example is a very practical example. the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, where you, Dalee, are, of course, a member from the Arctic region, the MRIP has been helping us a lot on the Finnish side, where we are currently working with a law amendment process. That's a long story, but MRIP has really provided us professional help, not only us, but also the Finnish government, and really you have offered your deep knowledge about Indigenous law and Indigenous rights to our use and also for the Finnish government to use, and acted as a sparring partner so that we really create legislation that is fully aligned with the latest developments in Indigenous law. And then more broadly, the UN is a really, really good ally for us, Indigenous peoples. And I want to mention, coming back to these decisions that I mentioned that concern the FPIC principle in terms of Sámi reindeer herding in the arm of Finland. These are typical examples of the treaty body decisions where the UN treaty bodies are giving the latest interpretations of the international human rights conventions. And those decisions are so important for us. There are several examples of different processes within Finland in terms of law amendment, where those decisions have given us really practical and concrete tools, and we've been able to take those decisions to the government and say, look, these are real human rights violations. And you as Nordic countries, you don't want to be countries that are not fulfilling the obligations of international law. So let's work together and try to fulfill solve these problems. And the same is happening now, and this kind of ties back to the discussion on ecocide. So these latest decisions about the human rights violations with the mineral exploration permits and so on, they are also a kind of a deterrent against especially international mining companies. And we are really hoping that international mining companies realize that it does not make sense, it does not pay off to come to the Sámi homeland because Indigenous rights are really strong, the FPIC is real, you have to follow it. And if you skip some steps and don't do it properly, it might lead to these really, really heavy consequences and these human rights violations. And that's one of the expectations that we have based on the latest decisions, that there's not so much eagerness to come and enter our territory where we have some of these precedents. And also then we hope that some of these treaty body decisions we can use to implement the FPIC better in the Finnish Mining Act and so on. So a lot of really good concrete things come out of the UN on various levels, and we are so grateful for all the help that we receive from there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think it's context specific. Yeah, when it comes to the UN. But Kate, I wanted to follow up and ask about, again, this intersection between Indigenous people's human rights and whether or not, in this dialogue and discussion about ecocide, whether or not there's been any commentary or even interest on the part of the human rights treaty bodies, but not the treaty bodies themselves, but of course the experts that are engaged in this work. Because I pose the question to Pirita because of the potential for the development of ecocide in international law and how it may then influence the interpretation and understanding of the rights of Indigenous peoples, especially when the UN Declaration references a safe and healthy environment and the productive capacity of the environment. But has there been any commentary? And then also, what's your estimation of this actually crystallizing as an avenue or a pathway forward, or a deterrent, as you described it, ecocide generally in international law?
So for the first part, yes, I'm from a human rights background. Mm-hmm. So ecocide and human rights, that's the framing for me, actually. And I've also written and argue about ecocide being interpreted through human rights. So understanding it through human rights, understanding the crime through human rights. And in some ways, international criminal law is criminalising the worst human rights violations, right? We can see it like that. So we have had some dialogue with some of the UN expert mechanisms, the special procedures, as they're called, to use the technical term, so the special rapporteurs and so on, mainly around also Indigenous rights, but also other economic, social and cultural rights. People, that's the group who are interested. So, you know, right to water, right to a healthy environment, right to housing, right to food and so on. And this is a dialogue that's just beginning, but there's a lot of interest from the human rights bodies in Geneva in this development. But I mean, I really feel like, I mean, you guys are in at the beginning. You know, this is happening right now. So this is the work that we need to do. And in fact, Dalee, you know, and we need to follow up on this together. What was the second part of your... the timeline, yeah. You know, I've always felt really sure that this was going to become an international crime. Ever since it even entered my head that there might be an international crime against the environment, as soon as those words crystallised in my mind, I thought, oh my God, that's going to happen. Like, that's the path we're on, and not for good reasons, right? We're heading somewhere where it's going to become clear that it can't be left to member states to do whatever they want in the face of the climate emergency. It is going to be taken out of the hands of individual member states and be made an international crime. I'm sure of that. What I didn't expect was how fast things have moved at the national and regional levels. So I mentioned that already the new Belgian criminal code has included a crime of ecocide. What I didn't mention is that there are proposals in states around the world to criminalise ecocide right now. And I'm talking about states as diverse as the Netherlands, where I'm based, Italy, but also Mexico, Brazil. I mean, it's really a groundswell. And of course, the development at the EU level was really important, because that's immediately going to go out into all EU member states. And the way international law works, of course, the more normal way for international law to work is there's something which is prohibited at national level, and then it becomes prohibited at international level, whereas we've kind of approached this on all fronts at the same time. But the developments that we're seeing at national and regional level are very important in terms of crystallising that international norm. So I think it's going a lot faster than we expected, and that is due to, you know, civil society action in a range of different countries around the world. And there's been huge support from different Indigenous groups for the crime of eco. Indigenous groups that have been using that word anyway in their own discourse for decades.
That's right.
I mean, this is not something that was invented by a bunch of lawyers a couple of years ago, right? This is something that has been seen as a meaningful term in Indigenous communities for a while. Yeah.
Thank you for the response. We have just a couple minutes left, and I did want to come back to the perspective on sustainable and equitable development. Kate has just referenced the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and I did want to give you an opportunity to share from your perspective whether or not it is possible, or have Sámi realize the potential for sustainable and equitable development.
Yeah, this is a huge challenge. We all know how much we talk about sustainability, and I'm a former business consultant, so I've seen a lot of development of ESG services and things like that. But one of the problems that we see from our point of view is that talk about sustainability is only empty words if Indigenous people's rights are not respected. You can't be sustainable if you impose industrial projects and developments on Indigenous people's land without their free, prior and informed consent. So that is one of the things that I hope you remember from this talk. And then another thought that I want to leave with you, and I've been thinking about this a lot for the last half a year or so when I've been working as the president of the Sámi Parliament. It feels like we are facing kind of a triple burden now. We have already talked about the double burden. We Indigenous people suffer from the global climate change and its impacts a lot more than kind of the average. And then secondly, we suffer from the mitigation efforts that are brought into our lands, the so-called green shift and green transition that we often consider green colonialism. But what we are also suffering from is that there are huge money flows going around the sustainability, ESG industry, even research, but we are not seeing a drop of that. And this needs to change. Indigenous peoples need to become part of the ecosystem of funding, financing projects where sustainability research is done or ESG actions are developed and kind of green financing. It's a huge ecosystem, but we are not benefiting from that at the moment, at least in Sámi, and we're trying to change that with our partners. And we're, for example, working on huge research projects which would help us to adapt to climate change. We need help and resources and support for doing that, because our reality is not only mitigating the climate change and reducing emissions, but there are such huge changes in reindeer herding, in fishing, in hunting, all of our traditional livelihoods, and we need to start the adaptation now. But we need help in developing those solutions for adaptation, but we're not seeing any of that money yet, so let's discuss afterwards.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it. It's absolutely an important point that we've had a long discussion about sustainable development, the SDGs and so forth, but the term equitable and I think the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples and their direct participation in every dialogue and in every decision is crucial to arrive at things that would in fact be equitable rather than waiting for things to trickle down. So, I just want to conclude the panel by hearkening back to some of the customary international law norms that have emerged, and in particular highlight the right of self-determination, which would afford Indigenous peoples their direct participation in matters that affect them. Also the right to autonomy and self-government. Land rights. The UN declaration's references to not only the profound relationship that Indigenous peoples have to their lands, territories, and resources, but also the safe and healthy environment, the productive capacity of the environment that has been a subject of your respective commentary, but also the right to reparations and redress, which would then, of course, emerge in the context of ecocide. There are two areas where we're beginning to see state behavior altered because of our advocacy, and I think Pirita has underscored them, but not explicitly said this norm emerging, or this customary international law rule emerging about direct participation in national decision-making. And if we think about even the earlier panels in this room today, imagine the direct participation of Indigenous peoples in national decision-making, whether it be about national economic agendas or about climate change or how we respond to the treaty concerning microplastics and plastics. We could pull together a long list. In addition, and this is kind of stunning, that there's greater clarity around the customary international law norm of a right to culture and a right to cultural identity and a right to cultural heritage specific to Indigenous peoples. And it's surprising to me that we have maintained our cultures, our identity, and our lifeways, yet we're still having to clamor for greater recognition of our distinct cultural identity so that we can fill out in a comprehensive way the cultural context for international norms responsive to us. So, Qianaktak to Kate, to Pirita, and Thank you to the audience for your interest in this particular panel.
Thank you.